Hi, macro students. Welcome to Lecture 4, Labor and Financial Markets. Today we'll look at supply and demand in the labor market and then also demand and supply in the financial markets. So mostly we've been looking at supply and demand in the production of goods and services. Now we're looking specific to labor markets and financial markets, and we'll talk about applying economic models. So when we think about the labor market, the thing to keep in mind is that on the left-hand side here, you'll see the price of labor is one way we could put it. So we talk about the price of goods and services, and then on the bottom, the quantity of those goods and services. Now, when we talk about labor, we're talking about the price of that labor, which we often refer to as salaries, and then the quantity of workers. In this case, we're using a specific example, nurses. And what you can see is there's an equilibrium point of when the quantity of nurses, people who want to work in nursing and nursing jobs available meet at that equilibrium cross point. We would have about 35,000 nurses and they would be being paid $70,000. And so if you're trying to pay more or less than that, it will either cause us to have a shortage of the number of nurses or positions, or the shortage of positions for nurses that we want. So equilibrium will get us to a point where both the amount of people wanting to work in that job and the number of those jobs available align. Like any other supply and demand curve, demand and supply can be shifted to the left or to the right. Always to the left is a decrease, always to the right is an increase. So A is a decrease in demand, and B, the second one on the right, is an increase in demand, and they tell you why. Maybe there's a decrease in skilled low labor. We don't demand as many people for these positions because there's been a new technological advancement that's replaced them. So we don't need as many people doing that job. Think of self-checkout versus cashiers. And then on the other side, we see that a technological change could actually drive a increase in the demand for people who are skilled in certain areas. For example, as microchips get put into everything, the need for programmers and computer scientists has increased. And it actually tends to widen the wage gap between those who are doing lower end jobs and those who are doing more sophisticated technical jobs. So when we look at the original equilibrium in this labor market, what we see is that whatever the work is, we would pay on average $10 an hour, and that would give us 1,200 workers. And they're not as specific. This is not saying nursing, it's just saying work in general, whatever that type of work might be. And if we were to go ahead and say, no, everyone should earn at least $12 an hour, that would be putting in that kind of floor, the minimum that you could pay for labor. If we were to do that, we would see that the demand, the number of jobs that are available for those workers might drop. In this case, they're showing to 700, where all of a sudden there are people who maybe weren't thinking of entering the workforce, but now because they make $12 instead of $10 would if there was a job. And so there's 1,600 people who'd like a job, but only 700 jobs available. And that's one of the fears, is that we can create this unemployment, those who'd like to work, those jobs that are available, by setting minimum wages. So those who aren't against minimum wage, that's the rationale why. I would tell you, I don't think this is the whole argument. When you increase people's pay, what also happens is you increase the number of people participating in the economy, their ability to buy. So it has other impacts, and it may not really create this kind of unemployment that's pictured here. So we're going to do our exercise in the middle, so you could pause the video if you wanted and work on it. But I would like you to imagine that there's a proposal that everyone should be paid who works 40 hours a week, a level that we believe they can provide for their family at. And maybe as a government, we've decided that living wage is $21 per hour, but currently the minimum wage in the country is only $10 an hour. And in fact, while that's the minimum wage, if you have 5 years work experience, maybe the average wage is currently $17 an hour, but we're going to say you can't pay anyone less than 21. So I wanted you to create a graph that would represent what you believe would happen in the labor market using what you just saw in the previous slides, and draw that out for me. And then list 3 to 5 unintended consequences to this increase in the minimum wage from $10 to $21. What are some of the outcomes of this that maybe weren't the things we were trying to make happen, but the results of a policy like this? When we look at a supply and demand curve, we have talked about goods and services, and just during this lecture, we've looked at the labor market. We also can talk about the financial market, where the good or service actually is money, and we're saying how much money is available and what interest rate is being paid to gain access to that money. And for an investor is more inclined to put their money out there. So one nation is willing to invest in another, or businesses are willing to invest their money in country treasury bills if they get higher interest rates. And so this supply line kind of looks at how much money would we put out there to be invested. Well, if I can make 10%, I'll put less money out, but if I can make 21%, I'd put more out. And then conversely, if I have to pay 21% interest, I want to borrow less, but my demand to borrow kind of increases. I'll borrow more money. So I'm up here at D at almost $800 billion I'll borrow if it's getting closer to that 10% interest rate. And similarly, there's an equilibrium. There's a point where those who are willing to loan money and those who are looking to borrow money match up at that equilibrium. And in this example, it's $600 billion borrowed at an average rate of 15%. So it's important to understand that our supply and demand curves can have goods and services. That's the most common. It could talk about the labor market, the availability of jobs, and the number of people skilled and ready to take those jobs. And then it can also talk about the value of money and how likely we are to make it available for borrowing or being willing to borrow that money. And so that's the financial demand and supply market. We see here that there was a shift to the left of the supply curve. A shift to the left is always a decrease. So there was a decrease in supply, and it tells us a little bit why over here. There was some uncertainty about U.S. public debt. So whether we're another country, whether we're a large company, or maybe we manage the benefits of a large retirement organization, for example, the teachers union here in New York or in California, and you're trying to decide, will we buy U.S. public debt? And all of a sudden you think that the ability of the government to pay that debt back is less than it used to be. And so your willingness to provide money to that government, to supply them with money, has shifted left. And so it would be harder for a country when there's uncertainty regarding the level of public debt, harder for them to borrow money, and probably more costly. They'll have to pay a higher interest rate to do so. Right now, we're borrowing lots of money at super low interest rates because we're seen as a very safe place to lend money to. And that's one of the reasons the government has been able to borrow so much. And the Federal Reserve is buying a lot of that debt. It's not other nations or other companies. So just a reminder that when we look at and set up the supply and demand curve, it works exactly the same whether we're talking about rate of return or interest rates. Same thing, rate of return or interest rates, and the quantity of financial capital available for borrowing and being borrowed, or whether we're talking about the price of wages, also called salary, and the quantity of people willing to work, or the price of goods and services and the quantity of goods and services available, which is what we've used most. So the curve works exactly the same whether we're talking about labor, currencies or finance, and goods and services. If we look at this example, it's specific again to nursing again, and what we have is D0 to D1. Remember, this is picture, motion in time. We've got what we've said is there's been an increase in the demand for nursing services. As a result, the demand curve is shifted to the right. And that shift has caused us to move from this equilibrium point, E0, to E1, which has moved us up in the price, so what we have to spend to hire nurses, and likewise increase the quantity of nurses available to reach this new equilibrium. So just to give a real life example of why that might happen, today healthcare keeps us living longer. As a result, we need more healthcare, particularly for the elderly who receive much more healthcare than younger individuals will. We're also in a pandemic, a crisis, so there's a need for more healthcare workers than there is when we're not in the midst of a health pandemic. And so there are reasons that could shift that demand curve to the right, and there's a couple real life examples for you. And finally, we just look at this slide that it lays out a little bit more of a story for us, and we have these motions, and what you want to do is you want to read the lower notes because they kind of take you through the initial picture, D0, S0, E0, everything with 0. That's the first snapshot, the easy picture, but then it tells you what happens in time 1. So as we start to turn it into a video and we move a little bit forward in time, we hit, QE1 and PE1 and the equilibrium 1, and we have a shift in. And so it tells us the demand for nursing increased. And that's what I just talked about, maybe an aging population, more medical support because we're in a pandemic. So that's the first thing that happened, is this movement. And we ended up here. Then we had a shift in supply that moved us to E2. And the reason they've given us in this specific case is there's a decrease in the supply of nurses, maybe because there were a lot of older nurses who are retiring, maybe because they're afraid of catching COVID, so people aren't going into that field. Maybe it's because there's pressure on colleges and they're not able to train as many nurses. What happened in real life here several years ago is they increased the requirements of education to be a nurse, and so they made it harder to become a nurse. You needed to stay in school longer for that to become the case, and so that could slow down, and for a time there'd be fewer nurses. You see that when you do the first movement, we increase both the quantity of nurses and what they get paid. The second movement, which is supply moving to the left, so demand moved to the right, always an increase if something moves to the right. Supply moved to the left, that's a decrease in the supply, and we've talked about why that might have happened. What that did is it actually brought the quantity of nurses down, but still drove the price of, or the salary that nurses earn, even higher. And it is possible that that shift could have been so extreme up here that we got back to that original quantity and an even higher salary for nurses. That's the reason that I don't believe that increasing minimum wage only creates unemployment. It also has an impact on the kind of work that people will do. But ultimately what it does is when you pay everyone more, they have the ability to buy more items and to spend more, or to spend more on each item. And so it impacts more than just the price of labor. All right, thanks. Hope you have a good week.